Susan didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed locked on David's, trying to see past his polished surface, trying to figure out if there was any humanity behind the cold proposition he'd just laid on the table. A million things ran through her mind. The months she'd spent sleeping under bridges, the bruises on her pride, the nights she went hungry just to hold on to her last shred of dignity. And now this man, this stranger, was offering to buy the one thing she never thought she'd trade: her body, her bloodline, her motherhood. Not with violence, not with pity, with cold cash and a handshake. The idea made her sick, and yet a part of her couldn't ignore it. She thought of the nights she had to fight off drunk men trying to take what they thought they owned, of the way people looked at her like she was trash, like she had failed as a human being. This? At least this was on her terms. She leaned forward slowly. How much? David didn't flinch. $500,000, 100,000 up front, the rest after delivery. Susan almost laughed. You think I'm just going to carry a child for you, push it out, and walk away like it never happened? That's exactly what I expect, David said. No emotional strings, no contact. You'll be compensated. You'll be free. Her fingers drummed on the table. And what if the baby gets sick one day and needs a donor? What then? You come find me when I'm halfway across the country. There will be provisions in the contract, but your obligation ends the moment you hand the child over. That's non-negotiable. The way he said it, like he was buying a car, not creating a life. Still, Susan said nothing. She needed time. To breathe, to think, to cry maybe, but she wasn't going to show weakness in front of him, not yet. Give me a night, she finally said, rising from her seat. I'll have an answer by morning. David nodded. Fair. She walked out of the restaurant without another word. The doorman opened the door with practiced ease, not even flinching at her worn-out clothes or the charcoal stains on her fingers. Susan didn't look back. That night she didn't go to the alley behind the bakery where she usually slept. Instead, she wandered the streets until she found a quiet bench in a park. Her head was full, but her stomach was empty. She held her sketch in her lap, the one David had seen her working on, and stared at it under the streetlight. It was a portrait of a mother holding a baby. Susan stared at the charcoal strokes, then suddenly pressed her fist into it, smearing the image until the faces were unrecognizable. She didn't sleep. By morning, her decision was made. When she walked into David's office the next day, wearing the same clothes, eyes bloodshot but fierce, she didn't hesitate. I'll do it, she said, standing tall despite the trembling in her chest. But I want one condition. David tilted his head. Name it. I get to see the child once, just once after it's born. Then I'm gone forever. He considered it, then nodded. Deal. They shook hands. Two strangers, making a pact that would change both their lives forever. What neither of them knew was that when the child was born, everything would unravel because the baby didn't look like David, not even a little bit. David stared at the infant, completely still. The nurses had just finished cleaning the baby, swaddled him in a soft blue blanket, and placed him in David's arms. The child was healthy, calm, barely crying, his tiny hands curled and uncurled with the innocent randomness of new life. But David couldn't hear a thing, not the soft murmurs of the staff, not the congratulatory remarks, just the pounding of his own confusion. The baby's skin tone was off, not dark, but certainly not his. His own complexion was olive, a blend of Spanish and Irish roots. The child was a soft, pale amber. His hair, too, already had a wavy texture, different from David's straight, dark brown. And then there were the eyes. Not hazel like his, not even close. They were a deep steel grey, unusual, haunting. David's jaw tightened. Susan, still groggy from the delivery, looked toward him with a strange expression. Her lips were cracked, her hair damp from sweat and her breath shallow, but her eyes watched David closely. He looked back at her, lowering the baby slowly into the crib beside the hospital bed. I thought there'd be no complications, he said quietly, voice tight. Susan gave a soft, bitter chuckle. He's healthy, isn't he? That's not what I meant. I know. The room was heavy now, thick with unspoken tension. David turned to one of the nurses. "Can you give us the room, please?" She nodded and slipped out quickly, shutting the door behind her. "You said you hadn't been with anyone else," he said sharply. "I haven't," she replied without hesitation. He looked at her long and hard, trying to decide if he was being lied to. He had vetted her background, had her tested, even had lawyers monitor the prenatal care. But genetics? Well, there were always surprises. Still, this felt off. He sat down in the visitor chair, rubbing his temple. This doesn't make sense. Susan, who was quiet, her hands fidgeted with the edge of the hospital blanket. "Did someone unforce you?" Her head shot up, eyes narrowing. "No. God, no." "Then how?" "My mother," she said suddenly, voice low, "was mixed race, half Ethiopian. My father was Irish. I don't know which traits passed down. Genetics are funny like that. Didn't your lawyers tell you to expect variance?" He was silent. He hadn't considered it. She went on, softer now. "You wanted a transaction." "No. Love, no connection, no past. But that child has a past, David, even if you don't want one." He didn't reply. The words cut deeper than he expected. Somewhere beneath the surface, the truth stung. Not because the child wasn't his, but because he hadn't really thought of the child as a person at all. Just a project, an extension of his empire, a solution to his loneliness. He stood up abruptly and walked over to the crib. The baby looked up at him, blinking slowly, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the hearts of the adults around him. David swallowed hard. "Fine," he said, almost to himself. "I'll do a paternity test, just to be sure." Susan's face didn't change. "Do whatever you need to do. I'll arrange for you to stay in the city until we get results." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "You owe me that one visit." David nodded stiffly. Then, without looking back, he left the room. Outside, the sky had darkened with the threat of rain. David stood under the hospital's awning, the weight of what just happened settling heavily on his shoulders. Something felt wrong. Not just the baby. Not just Susan's defiance, it was something deeper. He had everything he ever wanted, but for the first time, he wasn't sure he understood what he'd paid for. David didn't go home that night. Instead, he checked into a penthouse suite at the Carlton Towers downtown, one of the buildings he owned, ironically. But he didn't sleep. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, drink in hand, staring at the city lights with a blank expression. He was a man who'd spent his entire life avoiding complications. Emotions were weaknesses, relationships were risks. Even his decision to have a child had been calculated, not born from love, but legacy, control, strategy. And now the child might not even be his lawyers worked fast. Before sunrise, he had a lab technician and legal representative on their way to the hospital, DNA kits in hand. Susan didn't argue. She even welcomed the test. That rattled him more than if she had protested. It took 3 days to get the results. Those 3 days, David didn't visit the hospital once. He tried to throw himself into work, into meetings, into the comfort of numbers and spreadsheets. But it was like trying to ignore a house fire while sitting in the living room. He kept thinking about the baby, about the way its tiny hand had curled around his finger, about the uncanny calmness in its eyes. He even caught himself wondering what the child's name might be. He hated that. He had promised himself this wouldn't happen, that he wouldn't feel anything. When the call finally came, his lawyer didn't sound dramatic, just clinical, like always. "Mr. Lewis, the results are back. There's a 99.9% probability the child is yours." David didn't respond for several seconds. He hadn't realized until that moment just how deeply a part of him had expected, or maybe hoped, the answer would be no. He exhaled sharply. "Thank you." He hung up and sat in silence, his heart uncomfortably heavy. The child was his. And yet, nothing felt clear. At the hospital, Susan sat upright in bed, her baby resting in a bassinet beside her. She hadn't expected to feel anything either. She had signed up for a transaction, not motherhood. But every time the baby stirred, she moved without thinking, adjusting the blanket, whispering soft, nonsense words, watching for his breath. Her body knew what her heart didn't want to admit. She felt something, and it scared her. She had tried not to name him. She was supposed to walk away. But she called him Noah once in a whisper, and it stuck. When David finally appeared in the doorway 3 days later, Susan didn't say anything. She just looked at him, searching for clues, trying to guess if he'd come to take what he paid for or to tear the contract up altogether. He walked in slowly, his eyes going straight to the bassinet. The baby was awake, blinking lazily. Susan spoke first. "So?" David nodded. "He's mine." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. He moved closer, then hesitated. "You named him." "It was a mistake," she lied, gently stroking the baby's cheek. "I won't use it again." David crouched beside the crib, folding his arms on the edge and studying the child. "Noah," he repeated under his breath. The name was simple, soft. It didn't sound like a power play. It sounded human. A long silence passed between them. Susan finally broke it. "You said I could see him once, then I disappear." David didn't look at her. "That was the deal." She nodded, her throat tight. She couldn't cry, not in front of him. "I need 2 more days," he said suddenly. "To make arrangements." Susan glanced up. "For what?" "For everything. His care, nanny, living situation. I won't raise him in an apartment. He'll need staff, security. I'll handle it." He stood up. 2 more days. Then he paused at the door. "Would you want to help name him, officially?" Susan's heart jolted. She said nothing for a long moment, then barely above a whisper, "I already did." David nodded slowly, then left again, and this time Susan cried. The apartment David prepared for Susan wasn't just an apartment. It was an entire floor in a luxury residence in Midtown. Glass walls, heated floors, private elevator, a stocked kitchen with ingredients she didn't even recognize, a nursery that looked like something out of a designer catalog. But the moment Susan walked in with baby Noah in her arms, it felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was perfect, and yet nothing felt right. David stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the city below like it was a chessboard. He barely looked at Susan as she stepped inside. A team of staff followed, discreet but efficient. A live-in nanny, a private pediatrician on retainer, and a lawyer who handed her a sealed envelope with the finalized contract. The deal was done. David had his heir. Susan had her freedom. "Your transfer will be completed by morning," the lawyer said before bowing slightly and exiting the room. The staff followed. The door clicked shut behind them. Just the 3 of them now, David, Susan, Noah. Susan didn't move at first. She stood there, cradling her son, taking in the sterile elegance of it all. Everything about this place screamed wealth, but none of it felt warm. She glanced down at Noah. He yawned, completely unaware of the world he'd just been sold into. David finally turned to face her. "There's a private driver assigned to you, should you need anything. And a therapist if—" "I won't need a therapist," she cut in. He raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "You said I'd see him once," she continued, her voice tight. "Is this goodbye now?" David was quiet for a moment. He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted. Susan blinked. She had expected many things: coldness, dismissal, even legal threats to ensure her exit. But not this. Not uncertainty. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her not just as the girl on the sidewalk anymore, but as something else, someone who had just gone through something irreversible. "I thought this would be clean," he said, "that I could buy a solution." "You can't buy motherhood," Susan whispered, holding Noah closer. "I know that now." They stood there, the space between them suddenly filled with something too heavy to name. Susan gently laid Noah in the crib beside the oversized bed. He stirred, but didn't cry. She pulled the blanket over his chest and lingered a second too long, brushing his soft hair back from his forehead. When she turned around, David was still watching her. "You love him," he said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't want to," she replied, her voice breaking. "I tried not to, but I carried him, I talked to him, I felt him move. You can't walk away from that untouched." David walked to the minibar and poured himself a drink. "This wasn't supposed to happen to either of us," she said. He took a slow sip, then set the glass down. "What do you want, Susan? Money? Custody? Visitation?" "I don't want anything from you," she said, standing tall. "But I want him to grow up knowing love, not just wealth, not control, love. If you're going to raise him, you need to learn how to give it." David didn't respond. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't know how. Susan picked up her small bag, just a worn backpack she'd carried for years, and walked toward the elevator. She didn't say goodbye, and he didn't stop her. But as the elevator doors closed and she disappeared from view, David walked back to the crib and looked down at the tiny face that had quietly shattered his entire world. Noah blinked once, then smiled. It was the first time David Lewis, titan of industry, millionaire by age 30, felt something that terrified him more than any deal ever had: responsibility. Weeks passed. The luxury apartment, once echoing with silence and routine, began to hum with the quiet rhythm of a newborn's life. Bottles warming on the counter, late-night cries, soft lullabies played through a speaker system that had once only echoed classical music or market news. David Lewis was present but not involved. Noah had a full-time nanny, Gloria, a gentle woman in her 50s with decades of experience and a calm, maternal air. She kept everything running with mechanical precision. Feeding schedules, nap times, pediatric checkups. The baby was thriving under her care. But David remained a stranger in his own son's life. He watched from a distance, often behind glass. The same way he'd watched business deals unfold, markets shift, lives change. From the outside, he told himself it was for the best, that his presence would only confuse things. That children needed warmth, affection, tenderness, things he'd never learned to give. But the truth was simpler. He was scared, terrified, in fact, of holding Noah the wrong way, of hearing him cry and not knowing what to do, of seeing something in that child's eyes that reminded him of Susan, of the defiance, the fire, the unpredictability that he couldn't buy or control. He had built a world where he was untouchable. But this child had touched something in him that he couldn't turn off. One night around 2 a.m., David found himself unable to sleep. He poured a glass of water, walked into the nursery, and stopped just inside the door. Gloria was asleep on the couch, her head leaning against a pillow. A soft lullaby played on the speakers, and Noah, just 4 months old, was wide awake in his crib, his little legs kicking, his tiny fingers waving in the air. David approached cautiously, like a man, sneaking into a sacred place. Noah turned his head and looked at him, not with recognition, not yet, but with curiosity. Pure, unfiltered curiosity. David crouched beside the crib and stared back. "You have no idea who I am," he whispered. Noah gurgled. David smiled, surprised at himself. "You don't care about the companies or the penthouse or how much your father's worth. All you want is to be seen." He reached down slowly, fingers trembling, and picked the baby up. His body tensed as he adjusted the tiny weight in his arms. Noah didn't cry. He just rested his head against David's chest and sighed, a tiny, contented sound. It wrecked him. David stood there holding his son for the first time in weeks and felt the pieces inside him shift. Something long buried, something lonely and raw. The door behind him creaked softly. He turned, startled, and froze. Susan stood there. She hadn't meant to return, but ever since she'd left, something inside her refused to settle. She had tried to go back to the streets, not to live, but to remember, to find some version of herself before all this. But it was gone. She had changed, and more than anything, she missed her child, not because she wanted to take him back. Not out of regret, but out of love. So she came back just once to see if he was okay, to see if David was holding up his end of the deal. She didn't expect to see this. David, shirt slightly wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes, cradling Noah like he was holding something more precious than gold. And not out of obligation. Out of something real. He stared at her. She stared back. Neither spoke. Noah stirred and let out a soft whimper. David rocked him gently, awkward but genuine. Susan swallowed hard. I just wanted to see him. I'll go. No. David said, "Stay, please." Susan stepped inside slowly, her arms crossing over her chest for warmth or protection. Maybe both. David sat down on the edge of the crib and looked up at her. "I don't know what I'm doing," I figured, she said softly. I thought, I could just delegate, manage this like a project, like I do everything else, but he's not a project. "No, he's not," she whispered. "He's mine, and I'm scared I'll ruin him." Susan stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "Then don't do it alone." He looked at her, eyes searching. "You want to co-parent?" he asked, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "I don't know what I want," she replied honestly, "but I know what he deserves." Noah let out a sigh as if exhausted by their hesitation, and in that moment between two broken people and one tiny child who never asked to be part of this mess, something unspoken passed between them. Not a fix, not forgiveness, but the start of something they might learn to build, not for themselves, but for the child who had unknowingly brought them both back to life. The next morning, the city outside buzzed with its usual noise, cars honking, vendors shouting, taxis weaving. But inside the apartment it was quiet, peaceful. David sat at the breakfast table, Noah in a padded baby seat beside him, gurgling between tiny bites of mashed banana. Susan stood near the stove watching coffee brew, still unsure if she was a guest or something more. It had been hours since the awkward but powerful moment in the nursery. They hadn't discussed it. They hadn't defined anything. But they hadn't walked away either. Susan set a cup in front of David without a word and took her own seat across from him. The air was still heavy, not with tension, but with uncertainty. This new silence was different from before. It wasn't cold. It was cautious. David tapped his fingers against the porcelain mug. "You could stay a few days for Noah." Susan raised an eyebrow. "Just for Noah?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant," she said quietly. "And yes, for Noah." They ate in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the soft burbling of the baby and the clink of spoons against glass. "Have you ever held him like that before?" she asked suddenly, not looking up. David's fingers froze mid-stir. "Last night was the first time," she nodded. "You were nervous." "I still am." She gave a small, tired smile. "Good. That means you care." David exhaled deeply, setting down his spoon. "You could have disappeared. You had the money. You were free. Why come back?" Susan didn't answer at first. She looked at Noah, who was now staring up at the ceiling like it held all the answers in the world. "I never wanted to be a mother," she said. "Not like this, not through a contract. But then I met him, and everything changed. The first time I heard his heartbeat, it was like the noise in my head stopped just for a second." David looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't just the girl from the sidewalk anymore. She was the woman who had given him the one thing money never could, a future. "I don't know what this is," he said. "Us, this arrangement, you, being here." "Neither do I," Susan admitted. "But I think we both want the same thing." David nodded slowly. "For him to grow up better than we did." Susan glanced at him sharply. "What makes you think I didn't grow up fine?" He smiled faintly. "You're too smart not to be broken a little." She didn't deny it. "Maybe we both are." They sat there for a moment longer, two people whose lives were never supposed to cross like this, a millionaire and a homeless artist, bound by something far deeper than money or accident. Eventually, Susan stood and picked up Noah, cradling him gently. "He needs a bath." David stood too. "Let me." Susan raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "No," he admitted, "but I want to learn." She watched him for a second, weighing his words, then nodded. "Come on then. Time to see how many CEOs it takes to wash a baby." David chuckled, a genuine, unguarded laugh. The kind Susan had never heard from him before. As they walked down the hall together, side by side, with Noah in her arms and something unspoken beginning to form between them, Susan thought for the first time that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to walk away after all, and David, for the first time in his life, didn't feel the need to keep his distance. The warm water trickled from the faucet, steaming gently into the baby tub nestled on the marble counter. Susan rolled up her sleeves and carefully undressed Noah, who squirmed and kicked with the joy only babies seemed to possess. David stood beside her, arms slightly out, unsure whether to help or wait for direction. "Support his neck when you lift him," she instructed softly. "Like this." He watched her closely, not just her movements, but her calmness. The way she spoke to Noah in a sing-song voice, the gentleness in her hands, it was like watching something sacred. Foreign. "Now you try," she said, handing him a small towel. David hesitated, then leaned in, carefully cupping Noah's tiny body in his large hands. The baby let out a small wail, a protest at the cold air, and David's entire body went stiff. "He's fine," Susan said gently, smiling. "He just likes to complain." With her guidance, David slowly lowered Noah into the water, his fingers trembling slightly. The baby settled quickly, eyes closing in relaxation. The look on David's face was indescribable, a mixture of fear, wonder, and something else, something new. "Do you ever think about what he'll be like?" David asked, his voice unusually quiet. Susan was silent for a moment. "Every day." David dipped the cloth into the water and gently cleaned Noah's chest. "Do you think he'll hate us for how he came into this world?" Susan sighed. "Maybe, maybe not, but we don't get to decide that. What we do now, that's what he'll remember, or feel, even if he doesn't understand it." David nodded slowly, still focused on the baby. "I was raised to believe love was weakness, that emotions had to be buried, that control was everything." "I was raised in chaos," Susan said. "Love was loud and messy, it came and went. I learned not to depend on it. And yet here we are," she gave him a look. "Trying to raise a child neither of us planned on." David lifted Noah out of the tub, wrapping him in a warm towel. With surprising care, the baby cooed against his chest. "Maybe he'll be different," David said. "Maybe he'll have balance. Maybe he'll be better than us." They dried Noah together, dressed him and settled him into his crib. For a while neither of them left the nursery. They just stood there, watching him sleep. David finally broke the silence. "I don't want to do this without you." Susan turned to look at him. "I don't know what you want," he said. "I don't know if you see me as anything more than a deal you regret. But I know I want you around, not just for him, for me." Susan's face was unreadable, but her voice was steady. "I don't regret, Noah. I regret how we started, but I think I want to see how this plays out." David nodded, a little stunned by her honesty. "So, we take it one day at a time." She gave a tired but sincere smile. "One very messy, very exhausting day at a time." They walked out of the nursery together, side by side. Later that evening, while Susan napped on the couch, one arm draped protectively over Noah, who lay on her chest, David sat in the armchair across from them, his laptop open, but forgotten. He watched them with a softness that hadn't existed in him 6 months ago. He had everything he thought he ever wanted: money, respect, power. But now, watching a woman who once had nothing hold the only thing that truly mattered, David Lewis realized this, not the empire, not the contracts, not the wealth, was legacy. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally learning how to live. Morning light spilled into the apartment, soft and golden, washing over the hardwood floors and velvet curtains. The city beyond the window stirred like a restless beast, but inside peace settled over everything. Susan stood by the window with Noah in her arms, bouncing him gently as he made small, contented noises. David leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, just watching them. He no longer felt like a visitor in this scene. He belonged here now, and that realization both terrified and anchored him. "You know," Susan said without turning, "this is the longest I've stayed in one place in years." David stepped closer. "Do you miss the old life?" She turned her head slightly. I miss the simplicity, the certainty that nobody could take anything from me, because I had nothing to lose. She looked down at Noah, then back up at David. But now, I have everything to lose, and it's terrifying. David nodded, his throat tightening. I know the feeling. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun inch higher, casting light across the crib, the changing table. The shelves now filled with baby books and toys Susan had picked out. It didn't look like a transaction anymore. It looked like a life. A knock on the door broke the moment. David opened it to find Margaret, his longtime personal assistant, holding a thick envelope. I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Lewis, she said. These came from the Foundation Board, the legacy trust you set up. They're asking if you'd like to finalize the heir designation now. David took the envelope without replying. Margaret offered a polite nod, then left. He returned to the living room and stared at the paperwork. Everything I own, he said quietly. They want to know if it's going to him. Susan didn't flinch. You knew this moment was coming. I did, he said, but I didn't expect it to matter. He set the envelope down on the coffee table and looked at Noah again. The baby had fallen asleep, his cheek pressed to Susan's shoulder. He won't care about any of this, Susan said. He'll want your attention, your time, your forgiveness when he messes up, not stock portfolios. David sat beside her. Then I'll give him those things. Even if it breaks you? David smiled, tired but sincere. Especially if it does. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat there, holding their son between them, neither speaking, neither needing to. Years later, the world would know Noah Lewis as the quiet boy who painted stories with his mother and inherited empires from his father. The child who came from a transaction but was raised in something more powerful than either of his parents ever expected. Love, not. Perfect love, but the kind you fight for. The kind you grow into slowly, one day at a time. And in the end, that was the real legacy David Lewis left behind. Not money or buildings, but a boy who changed 2 lives before he could even say his first word.